and look at Cyprian more specifically. And actually in the next two lectures, we're going to look at the two main issues that Cyprian faced as the bishop. Both of these were brought on by the fact that he was the bishop in the middle of a period of persecution. So persecution ebbed and flowed. First we have Decius, then we have Valerian. And so there's an initial period of persecution, after which Cyprian is still the bishop. He hasn't been killed yet. But you have a bit of a calm period in the persecution. And when the initial first wave of persecution ends, there's a problem. Because you have in the church then different kinds of people, different categories of people who are now coming to the church, who are now coming to worship with the community. And you have one category which we might call martyrs or just witnesses. These are people who may have been near death, and some of them are there. So you have to imagine a room in which some people are coming to worship and they physically are bearing the scars of what happened to them. Maybe they were tortured. Maybe they were put in front of the wild beast. They may be missing limbs. They could have distortions of their facial features. And then you have confessors. These are people who also bore witness. The word martyr means to bear witness. But they lived. Maybe they were just put in prison. And they have some kind of special authority, but they were put in prison. So now you have in one part of the congregation someone who's been near death, and someone else who maybe was beaten, put into prison because they refused to give up their faith. They refused to offer the sacrifice. And then you have people who are called the lapsed. To lapse means to basically fall away from something. These are people who had offered the sacrifice. When they were forced to offer a sacrifice or be imprisoned or killed for treason, they offered the sacrifice. But now they've come back to church. We're sorry we did that. We're back. We never really gave up our faith, and now we're back. And within this category of people who are considered lapsed, we have a few subcategories. We have those who actually made the sacrifice. These are people who actually made the sacrifice. And they were considered apostate, and they gave up their faith. They literally gave up their faith because they made the sacrifice. And so they're guilty of making a sacrifice to an idol, to a pagan god. This is a very terrible offense against the faith. And you also have people who are called the libellus getters. These are the people who bought a libellus, a little book from someone else. So this is the person who paid the neighbor to go and get one, or the person who bribed the local official so they could get the little receipt. So let's just stop and think about this situation. You're sitting in a room. Let's imagine that your son was killed. Your son was martyred because he refused to give in at the moment of trial. Sitting next to you is a woman whose son made the sacrifice, who at the same moment of testing made the sacrifice and lived. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that when you go to take the Eucharist, you're taking the Eucharist with someone who gave in? Or what if you lost your wife, but the person next to you bribed the local official to get the libellus? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about being in a room with them? If the Eucharist is partaking of the one bread to show unity, do you feel unified with someone who gave in? With someone who said, I gave in, but I was crossing my fingers behind my back, which in American culture means this doesn't really count, right? If you say something with your fingers crossed, you can lie because you're not really meaning it. I didn't really mean it. I just did it. I figured it was better to bribe someone. Or now you have all these people in the same room. And those who were confessors, who were beaten, tormented, They don't want anything to do with the people who fell away. So what do you do with the lapsed when they come back to church? What do you do with the lapsed when they come back to church? Cyprian, as the bishop, has to deal with this issue. It's a very real issue. It's not some hypothetical idea. This is, what do you do with people who gave up their faith either by making the sacrifice or paying a bribe, and then come back and want to take the Eucharist with people who were imprisoned for their faith? How do you preserve that unity, or do you preserve that community? Okay, so what to do about the lapsed? And there are different approaches to this, and we're going to see where Cyprian fits into this. The confessors seem to be among the most, if we could say, forgiving of all. The confessors seem to say, well, we have the power to forgive. So you might think, well, the confessors, they might be the least likely to forgive, but because the confessors were seen to have spiritual authority, because they had stood up for their faith, people would go directly to the confessors and say, can you forgive us? The confessors would seem to think, yeah, we have the authority to forgive people. Yes, I forgive you. Well, how does a bishop feel about that? How does a bishop feel about someone else in the church giving forgiveness to the lapsed? And then you had the more rigorous position, the stricter position. And there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is, you could only be forgiven if you're martyred. This was one of the positions that people took. If you fell away from the faith, or if you bribed someone in the moment of trial, the only way you can make up for that is to die for your faith. The only way to make up for it, the only way to be right in God's eyes, is to do what you should have done before. Be a martyr, you can be forgiven. Others thought, well, okay, you can be forgiven, but only on your deathbed. You have to go through penance, you have to be sorry, and you have to be sorry for the rest of your life. But you can never be back in the church until your deathbed. So you could come, but you can't take the Eucharist. But on your deathbed, if you're really penitent, if you spend the rest of your life showing how sorry you are for what you did, at the moment before you die, we'll let you back in the church, and then you can go on to heaven. So in these different positions, we really have a kind of a philosophical question. The philosophical question is, what is the church? What is the church? What is the church for? What should the church be like? I'm going to offer you two different images here. Is the church like a clean room where they make little microprocessors for computers and everything has to be perfectly clean? Only the clean, only people who have washed their hands in a certain way and are wearing certain suits, only they can get in. Is that what the church is? Is the church a place only for the pure? Is the church a place only for those who are clean? Only those who are clean can get in. If you have dirty hands, if you're not wearing all the right suit, you're not going to get into the clean room at Apple Computers. Or is the church a hospital? Is the church that by its very nature exists to help the people who are sick, who are bleeding, who are dying, who are imperfect? What is the church? If the church is a clean room, then you don't want the lapsed there. They're impure. You want them out. If the church is more of a hospital, then of course the lapsed of all people need to come to the hospital. With this idea, Jesus said, it's not those who are healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So those who take this approach would say, it's the sick people. The lapsed are sick. They need to come back to the church. As you can imagine, this puts the bishop in a very difficult position. Because you have a divided group within your community. And in addition to that, you have the confessors who are offering forgiveness. But if you're the bishop, how do you feel about that? And does everyone else accept that the confessors can forgive them? Very complicated interpersonal, social, anthropological, political situation. In addition to the fact that at any time, the Roman officials could come back again and kill you this time. So sometimes people think that bishops are power hungry. I don't think any of us would want to trade places with Cyprian. The Roman officials really want to kill you, and everyone in your congregation can't get along. Actually, it sounds like a lot of pastors that I know, but this is not an enviable position. So where does Cyprian fall? He writes a work for us called On the Lapsed. De Lapsis, On the Lapsed. How do we deal with those who have lapsed? And the question he's trying to answer is, how can they be welcomed back? If they can be welcomed back at all. So he doesn't begin by saying, of course we should welcome them back, or of course we shouldn't welcome them back. He leaves the, I guess you could say the conclusion, he leaves the conclusion open at the beginning. He really is addressing this question. This is the question that people are asking. How can we welcome them back, if we can welcome them back? And Cyprian's first most important move is not to address the question of the lapsed. He doesn't talk about persecution. He talks about unity. Unity. His primary concern is unity. So, wait a minute, let's not get caught up in who's in which group. First and foremost, he says, the first and most important principle for the church is unity. The church must be unified. That's my guiding principle that I'm working from. So whatever we decide, it has to preserve the unity of the church. And in contemporary debates today, in various churches and in various denominations, different people have different approaches. Some people say the most important thing is correct doctrine, or some people say the most important thing is correct practice. And other people are saying, even if we disagree on some elements of theology and we disagree on some elements of practice, the most important thing is unity. And each of us may have different answers to which one is most important. He says unity. He offers the possibility of forgiveness. But he says, let's be very clear about this. If unity is going to be restored in the right way, it has to happen through the church, under the authority of the bishop. Not with the confessors. Not with the confessors. If we're going to restore unity, it has to be through the church, through the organization of the church, and through the hierarchy of the church, through the bishop. If there's going to be forgiveness given, the bishop grants forgiveness, not the confessors. The confessors can't take the spiritual leadership in the church. God has ordained, from Cyprian's perspective, God has given us a certain order of things. And that order of things is we have bishops. And those bishops are responsible for the spiritual health of their flock. The confessors are not. And you may think, well, what's the problem with the confessors? Well, the problem and it's not just that Cyprian's being power hungry. If the confessors tell you what you want to hear and the bishop tells you what you don't want to hear, any question you have, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the confessors. Growing up, and I'll say this on tape, growing up, I knew it was easier to get something from my mother than it was from my father. So when I wanted something, I always went to mom first. And I'm seeing some heads nodding. Other people have had this experience, right? Cyprian realizes if we open the door to confessors having the authority over the flock in this way, the authority to forgive one of the greatest of all sins, walking away from your faith in the face of persecution, we're opening a door that we can never close. So he says, okay, has to happen through the church, it has to happen through the bishop. And he says, yes, we can restore the lapsed, but only on their deathbed. So this is a strict position. This is a rigorous position, but it's not the most rigorous position. The most rigorous position is they can never be restored, or they have to die as martyrs. Cyprian doesn't go that far. For the sake of unity, he says we can restore them. In other words, this is what Cyprian wants. He ultimately wants all of the lapsed to be restored to the church. That's what he wants. He wants the unity of the church restored. But it has to happen in the right way. The church, under the authority of the bishop, has to oversee this. Show that you're penitent. Come to here. Come to the community meetings. Come to church. Come and hear what we have to say. Be part. And when you're about to die, we will fully restore you to the church. He wants them to come back. He doesn't want to drive them away. He wants them to come back, and eventually he hopes to restore all of them to the full community, the full union of the church. But not immediately, as the confessors might say, and not never, like some others might say. So for Cyprian, what's the church? Is it a clean room or is it a hospital? Well, I guess we could say it's certainly more of a hospital. If you're sick, you need to be here. And right before you're dead, this is a strange metaphor for a hospital, right before you die, you're going to get well. Right before you die, you're going to be well. You're going to be healthy. We're going to restore you to full health before you die, which is not usually what hospitals do. But that's how Cyprian imagines it. So, as I said earlier, this is not just some hypothetical thing floating out there in space. People have to look at each other. People have to look at each other. And I know of cases in churches where two brothers got into an argument 25 years ago about something stupid. And now they both go to the same church and they sit on opposite sides of the church and their families don't interact with each other. And you may know similar kinds of cases of people who have decided for some reason they don't want to have anything to do with each other. We go to the same church, but we're not going to associate with those people. And often, and it's never over, did they die for the faith or not? It's usually, in fact, always over something much smaller than that. Here, life and death was what was in question. And Cyprian said, I want unity. And in time, unity can be restored. But it needs to happen in the right way. So he's a more rigorous person in this way. More strict, but not the most strict. He still has a pastor's heart. He wants the lapsed to be in heaven. He wants them to be right with God. And in time, that will happen. So questions about Cyprian and the lapsed and his work on the lapsed and how he's trying to deal with a very practical pastoral problem. Yes?
I have a comment about around the same time we had, for example, Origen of Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
Origen, when he explained the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, he described it as having a major sin after baptism.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the most rigorous people are saying that are influenced by these explanations that maybe they performed a sin that cannot be forgiven.
So the questions about Origen of Alexandria, talking about blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit after baptism being the most severe of all sins. And yeah, I'm not sure how much they may have been influenced by Origen, but you raise an interesting point because, so for example, Constantine, we're getting, I guess, a little bit ahead of ourselves, but the story is that Constantine converts to Christianity. Well, Constantine's not actually baptized until he's on his deathbed. Because Constantine does a lot of really awful things. He kills a lot of the members of his family. After he so-called converts to Christianity, he kills a lot of people in his own family. And we see a tradition that develops within the church of holding off baptism until the deathbed, right? Because of the fear of what happens afterwards. So someone like Tertullian is very rigorous on sin committed after baptism. So this may feed into this tradition of you hold off on baptism until you're about to die, and then you're baptized, and then you're not going to commit any terrible sin after baptism. So this may be a difference. And one would wonder, and I'd have to look back in the sources, people who were catechumens, who were in the process of being taught, if they were faced with this dilemma, are they treated differently than those who have already been baptized? And that's a historical question that I don't know off immediately. I could look and see if there's more information, but that is a possible distinction, baptism or not. In this case, Cyprian seems to be talking about people who have already been baptized, who should know better, who've already decided they're all in for God, and then back out. Yes?
I think at the same time there was persecution in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So why we don't see the same challenge in Egypt about the lapse and the purity of the church and so and we don't find a specific bishop dealing with the same problem as Cyprian.
Yeah, so the question is, in Egypt around the same time, there's also persecution, so why don't we see the lapsed issue in Egypt? Why don't we see these same dynamics? And there are different theories on this. And one of the theories is that North African Christianity, just in general, was more rigorous, was stricter. And so if we look at North Africa versus Rome, in almost every case, the Roman bishop is more lenient, is more forgiving than the Bishop of Carthage. That's almost every case. So is there something about the personality of North African Christianity that is very strict and very rigorous, such that this becomes an issue where it may not be as much of an issue in other places, where if the general tone of Christianity is less strict and less rigorous and less demanding, then perhaps the issue of the lapsed is dealt with more easily. Maybe there's not the instinct to want to kick everyone out in the same way there is in North Africa. And that's a debated conclusion, but we do see a pattern where the African church, certainly compared to Rome, because that's the primary conversation part during this period, is Rome. The African bishops almost always come out stricter than the Roman bishops. So maybe there's something about the general personality of this region that feeds into this. Yes?
Just a comment, not a question, but there is a book, the Apostolic Traditions.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying when you ordain a confessor,
Yes.
the bishop will not ordain him because his confession of faith is enough for him to be ordained as a priest. He don't need something extra.
Yeah, so the comment is in the Apostolic Traditions, there's a comment that if a confessor is ordained, a bishop doesn't need to ordain him because his act of confession in the face of persecution has already basically given him his spiritual authority. Yeah, so that's a reflection of the authority that the confessors are seen to have in some cases. And it's clear from multiple cases, not only in Africa, that the power of the confessors is at points a threat to the bishop. In the same way that in a later period, the power of people like the Desert Fathers can be a threat to the bishop, and to people like Simeon Stylites can be a threat to the bishop. So there are multiple times in which other charismatic figures in the church can create potential conflicts of interest with the bishop. And we see in different contexts how the bishops handle that, not always in the same way.